Hello,
Hello.
Taylor. Welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm alright. We've not had the best weather here.
Is it colder?
Yeah, and rainy. Haven't seen the sun in like a week.
I haven't seen rain in weeks, and I'm in England.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah,
At least you
exactly.
made the right choice in location.
I landed in the right place. I have now been in
Right.
England for 367 days. On this particular occasion, I was born in England too, a long time ago.
Yeah. You left for England, I think, right after our show we had.
Yeah, it affected me that much. I just had to. I had to
You
get
just
away.
Had to get the hell out of the country.
Due to the pandemic, of course, that was the final Back to the City showcase, at least for now.
Yeah, that was our last show we played.
And the last show you played, it was one of the last shows that you could have played, I suppose. A few
We had
weeks after
two
that.
tours coming up.
You referred to them. You referred to them in the interview, which was also one of the last interviews that I did.
Mm-hmm.
In that interview, and also in your music, there were lots of unconventional religious references. And of course, there's Mary behind you as well. Mary's with us.
That is correct.
Kermit's with us too, by the way, if you're wondering whose feet these are.
Excellent.
That's Kermit's feet. You know, he's not shy, but he's also not the center of attention on this particular occasion. You are, in fact. A reason why Back to the City is being resurrected with another Partition interview is because, yeah, there we go. You see what I did there with the metaphor. I think that the themes that we were beginning to explore in our interview about 30 months ago are more and more relevant. In particular, the exploding the dichotomy of good and bad and love and hate. I think that will be good to return to as a topic. Another moment in the interview that has stayed with me and that I think is deserving of deeper focus is where we were talking about being unwitting participants and humans as a whole being somewhat unwitting participants in the drama, in the human drama. That's a phrase that you used in our interview at MCN6. Could you begin by expanding a little bit on the significance of that phrase, unwitting participants?
I'm going to grab my notebook real quick so I
Yeah.
can bring it, and that ties back right to the opening quote on the Adam Curtis documentary.
Yeah, which I have as well. But yeah, let's both have our notebooks. We're going to do various things in this interview. One thing that we'll do is have a conversation, an in-depth conversation about part one. Bloodshed on Wolf Mountain is the name of part one of Adam Curtis's Can't Get You Out of My Head documentary.
The ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something we make it. So in a way, like, I feel like people are unwitting participants in the way that they feel like society is a fact.
And what does it mean for a person to think that society is a fact?
Just to accept certain constructs like marriage or credit scores, really, to accept all of those things as something that has to exist.
I'm so glad that you recommended this documentary because it's a reflection on kind of 20th century history, not just in the States and not just in Europe, but also in China and in Russia, where there are various people seeing that others are bad. They're bad,
Right.
so I'm going to be a good alternative to that. It's quite easy to empathize and think, yeah, this person's being oppressed, and yeah, they seem like the good character here. Then invariably, at least with the cases that are looked at in all 6 parts of the documentary,
Absolutely.
the good-bad dichotomy is exploded. The individual who perceives themselves as the good alternative to the bad system ends up reenacting the thing that they're opposed to in ways that we'll look at. That relates so much to the themes that came up in our previous interview and that are in the songs and that are even connoted by the name Partition. It's so closely aligned to what's going on in your music. Could you talk a little bit about your discovery of the documentary and how it resonated with your thinking?
I have a podcast I really like called Trillbillies,
Ah,
which are
cool.
some
Okay.
communists like in Kentucky and Appalachia, and I'm from Appalachia, so it's one of my favorite pieces of media out there.
Hmm.
And they were talking about this documentary. They were talking about Tupac in it, which he's not in there until way later on. He's kind of like only briefly mentioned, but alluded to a lot.
Yeah.
But I thought it would be like communist Ken Burns, and it was sort of like that, but also much more psychological as well.
Yeah.
And very interesting how they follow genealogies. Since I rewatched the first one today, right? So I could be fresh. And it just makes you realize more how everything connects. Because I was also pausing it and taking notes, so I was also able to like sit with some ideas for a second. Whereas like watching it the first time, I was just kind of being bombarded.
Yeah.
They're very hefty.
Something else I should highlight is I'm working on a book, and there's a chapter on partition in the book.
What's it going to be called?
I don't even know whether it's going to have Back to the City in the title. I mean, it all emerges from Back to the City interviews, but it's really a work of philosophy,
Right.
but an unconventional work of philosophy where rather than Simon being the philosopher who figures it all out and shares his ideas, I feel that my work through Back to the City, which is just what I was doing because I was drawn to honoring what people were doing with their music, relates to what I was doing with my PhD before I moved to Minneapolis. So this weird period of being in England has enabled all of that to land, and this strange book is being formed. And it is a work of philosophy, but every chapter is focusing on a different Minneapolis music act and insights that I found myself coming to through the encounter with the creativity of, for example, Partition. Fragmentation is very important in the book, recognizing, responding to the fragmentation, thinking about where that comes from. I'm pretty sure fragmentation will be in the title of the Partition chapter. The candidate title for that chapter at the moment is On Partition and Facing Fragmentation. But you can help me come up with an even better title if you like to. So yeah, I'm excited. And this present encounter is a part of it too. The claims of science are something that both the documentary and my book are kind of skeptical about. So in the first chapter of the book, which is on Mark Moorman's The Happiness Playlist book, if I remember correctly, Partition was one of Mark's pick-to-click bands. Is that correct?
Oh, that's sweet. That might be true. If it is, that's kind.
Yeah, I think Mark made some kind of rated Partition in some way at some point. In any case, Mark is conducting an experiment in the book, The Happiness Playlist, an experiment regarding what the impact on his well-being will be of listening to a certain playlist of feel-good music. He's experienced a traumatic event, and he, for a number of months, listens exclusively to certain music. And he refers to it as an experiment. And so my book, which features a chapter on Partition, begins by taking that claim that Mark is conducting an experiment there seriously. And there's of course obvious rebuttals to that. Someone could say it's not objective and so on. But especially if we are experimenting with subjective states, the claims of science to be able to make proclamations about what leads to happiness and so on, there's a whole different set of problems and that relate to those kinds of claims. So the introduction of this book makes a philosophical argument for the greater legitimacy of creatives' claims, especially musicians, to be discovering things about flourishing, about suffering through their creative endeavors. And there is something truly experimental there, No one's claiming that these experiments, that your musical experiments, for example, are objective and the same as what happens in a laboratory. I'm claiming that these experiments are more likely to yield meaningful results related to the nature of flourishing and well-being than the scientists can. That's kind of enough of a framework for this book. Taylor, I think, is also going to perform a song at some point. Is that correct? Do you feel like performing a song?
I do, about my anthem touch.
Perfect. I'm very excited for that. Is the song going to be Fear Machine?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So Fear Machine will be on the second Partition record.
Correct.
Is it fair to say it's your favorite song on the second Partition record, which is yet to exist?
It has some of my favorite lyrics, and it is one of my favorite songs on the album.
Okay.
It's a highlight of the textures.
So sonically, as well as lyrically, then, if it's a highlight of the textures. There's basically three things that we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the documentary, we're going to witness and delve into the song Fear Machine, which I also really like the lyrics. I've never heard it before, unsurprisingly, because it's on a record which hasn't been released or recorded. But I will.
Okay, that's cool. You read it first. That's cool.
Yeah, the lyrics are really significant. They're what led me to the documentary, because I was asking you some questions online about the lyrics. So we will talk about the documentary, we'll delve into the song Fear Machine, and my table that I have just here is covered in books that relate to the questions, the concepts, the themes that came up in our previous interview. So I'm sure there'll be at least some books that pop up at some point. I wonder whether you're familiar with any of these books, by the way.
I might have to write some titles down.
Do you know the quantum physicist David Bohm?
I know that name, but that's pretty much it.
This book by him is called On Dialogue, and there's a chapter in this book on dialogue called The Nature of Collective Thought. So very much on theme with the Curtis documentary. I'd be quite surprised if this book doesn't make an appearance later on. That's just one of a number of books I have on my desk. I'll surprise you with at least one other one later. So let's begin with Fear Machine. We're going to give everyone else the same experience that I had of witnessing the lyrics first. We'll do the lyrics justice. We'll have a kind of philosophical discussion about the lyrics and what the song means to you. And then we'll witness the song, and then we'll take into account the component which I'm not familiar with yet, which is how it sounds.
Right.
Sound good?
I'll have you read it. It'll be interesting to hear how it sounds.
With an English accent. Yeah. Okay, Fear Machine by Partition. I breathe in bone marrow just like oxygen, and thus the line and mitosis and Oedipus again. Break my heart, then buy it. Break my heart, then buy it. How about if we pause there for a moment? You can correct me if I got anything wrong.
No, you didn't.
Got everything right. And the opening lyric is, I breathe in bone marrow just like oxygen. That's obviously a very forceful image. It's very visceral. And we're focusing on the body. Some obvious statements about this lyric. We breathe in oxygen, that's good for us. We like breathing in oxygen. Breathing in bone marrow, it sounds less pleasant than breathing in oxygen. Yes?
Right.
What is the significance of that lyric for you?
The first line kind of means it's easy for me to do something good as it is bad. Like the character in this equation of myself, like a feeling of like the facility of doing something wrong.
It seems odd. It seems off. It reminds me of the lyric, I'm not well.
I'm off, but I'm not well.
I'm off, but I'm not well. So there's something off about that first lyric about breathing in bone marrow. That's just simply bad. Breathing in oxygen is good. Breathing in bone marrow, not good. Bad, in fact. It would be the conventional response. What's mitosis and Oedipus? How do they relate?
That is kind of a statement, I guess, on like the nepotism of kind of any arts industry, where it just seems like they create within themselves,
Yep. Okay. So maybe there's like
where it's
a
almost
clique.
incestuous in a way.
An Oedipus, of course, from Greek mythology, the Oedipus complex in Freud makes me think of the final song on the Prodigal Gun records. How is Oedipus popping up here?
I guess I was feeling in this moment maybe a bit defeatist that I don't have like a chance of being successful, like in like stereotypical terms, because I have no like in or whatever. And like with Oedipus, it's like he has his mother like in an infatuation in that way, know. Okay. And the mitosis part is it just kind of happening over and over again.
Okay, so there's this loop, there's this cycle, and there's this repeated sense of exclusion, which of course I think relates to, the prodigal son story again, the sense of being bad. The lyrics at the end of the song, Prodigal Gun, I am the weak one, I am the idle son. So there's this self-identification as bad, which is reinforced by the social framework as it presently exists. It's not just or even not primarily the individual that is conceiving themselves as bad. They are conscious of being labeled bad by this community. Is that
interesting?
Do you think so? Is that
I agree with that. It's an interesting way you put it. I like it though.
One feels the same shame, perhaps, or one still feels shame at being cast as bad. But there's also an awareness that there's something off and inauthentic about this whole thing. So there's simultaneously this kind of shame.
Like the structure itself.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And the holding together of those two things is really important, I think. Definitely something we'll be able to delve deeper into with the help of the documentary. And goes back to the fragmentation that we talked about in the previous interview, what the band name Partition means. Could you give a little summary of how all of that ties in together?
Well, basically, Partition is me, and to boil things down, my mother is good, my father is bad, and I'm half and half.
Shortly after we got to that point in our interview before, God and the devil came up too. So like within the conventional Christian framework, say the framework of the Christian church, then certainly God is good, devil is bad, and and there's lots of story. Yeah, Judas, we have Judas-like people. If someone betrays me, then I might identify them as like Judas from this kind of conventional Christian perspective. It's pretty entrenched in this good-bad thinking, which we're kind of working within a certain culture. We've inherited that, but there's a sense of the offness about that. It's kind of like a game on some level. People are playing these roles, and it's serving some people better than others to be casting some people in certain roles as opposed to others.
Right.
Okay. Break my heart, then buy it. That's interesting. That's repeated. So in the book that I'm writing, in a number of chapters, there's a focus on not just the brain, which we'll talk about a lot in relation to the documentary, but also the heart as actually an organ of perception. So a type of knowing can happen with the heart that is different from, and perhaps doesn't have all of the same problems.
That's definitely kind of
doesn't have the same problems as the brain.
I would also incorporate that into the definition of partition, because it's almost like the brain is good and the heart is bad in a way.
Right.
The brain will always keep you safe, right?
Right. So back to this conventional good-bad thinking. in this
Right.
kind of caricature version of it, which, you know, bears at least a pretty strong resemblance to the truth of how things, of how this thinking works. If we are good, then, you know, we will use our minds, our brains, to control ourselves, to control the sinful urges that we have. And if we're
also like in ego.
Yeah, exactly. For Freud, again, there's this similar sense that we are essentially bad unless we're very good at controlling our badness.
Right.
And there are certainly some people who don't think in this way, but it's pretty culturally pervasive. The fact that it's in Freud and it's in conventional Christian thinking, this sense that we are essentially bad, and some of us are less bad than others if we are very controlling of ourselves, courtesy of our brains, and then others are particularly bad if they just follow their heart. So if you follow the heart, it can lead you into all kinds of uncivilized situations, and that makes you bad.
Uncivilized situations.
If the organ that is the heart is enabling some type of cognition that is different from the type of cognition that we obviously primarily identify with the brain, so that raises radical problems for this good brain, bad heart scenario. So that's something we'll keep on coming back to, and it's just so interesting that the heart is coming up here. Do you have any thoughts on that particular lyric, break my heart, then buy it?
I think it kind of goes along with the, like, I suck vibe of the beginning of the song, you know?
Uh-huh.
And it also has irony, which I enjoy because, you know, if you break it, you buy it.
Yes, yeah.
And I actually originally wrote that in high school before we had some contest where you had to write a story in 6 words.
That's a good story. That is a good story. Again, for Freud, we do exist in this reality where basically we're going to be hurt or we're going to hurt someone else. The only alternative to that is to kind of control our urges. This book that I'm writing is a little bit more optimistic about the human condition than that, but also focused on the darkness, accepting the darkness, shadow work. It's that kind of book. There's a pessimism about human nature in Freud and in the conventional Christian perspective. There is a way beyond this that paradoxically could relate to the figure Christ. There's one book here called The Wisdom Jesus, Transforming Heart and Mind, a New Perspective on Christ and His Message. This is a really interesting book. It strangely relates to some of your lyrics and so on, and it's about, again, the heart as a organ of perception that troubles the binary thinking of the brain.
I mean, Jesus was a radical. Like, he only does cool stuff in the Bible.
It's interesting that you say he was a radical, because the particular radicals that we experience in the documentary end up not being able to live up to their own picture of the good person. And the documentary seems to be suggesting that there's something about the nature of reality and the way in which the brain works that leads to that being the case. How is Jesus's radicalism, as you observe it in the Bible, different from the radicalism that we'll experience in the documentary?
Well, his radicalism in general, he's hanging out with prostitutes and lepers, and he's telling the people in synagogues that the money is ruling them, and etc.
Yeah, and that takes us back full circle to buy it, break my heart, then buy it. So here we're kind of stuck within this kind of socially constructed framework where people are buying and selling themselves and each other. And Jesus doesn't like that. You know, like he's, when that's happening at the temple, he gets angry.
Right. How he is different from the radicals in the documentaries is that he's perfect, right? and he gets crucified and he doesn't even really die. He's always there, you know, and almost every person almost in the documentary, you're like, wow, that's interesting, you know, and then you're like, oh, I see where that went wrong. You know what I mean?
An interesting hypothesis about what's going wrong in each of these quite diverse cases could be the conceiving of oneself as perfect, the aspiration to be perfect, and to define oneself as the moral ideal, as the moral exemplar.
Which is like a tenet of Christianity in general, to be like Jesus.
Yeah, interesting. And there's that phrase, isn't there? Is it "be thou perfect"?
I know what you're referencing, but I do not know it word for word.
Yeah.
I got a few Bibles.
Although it often generally gets translated "be thou perfect," and an alternative translation could be thou whole. And this is the idea related to heart knowledge that I think it will be fruitful to kind of circle back to at points in our conversation. Because there's a big difference between witnessing the imperfection of others and responding to it by endeavoring to be perfect, and on the one hand, and witnessing the imperfection of others and endeavoring to be whole. It's difficult to talk about, but I think that we will, through engaging with the documentary and your lyrics and some other ideas, be able to delve a little bit further into this alternative way of responding to witnessing evident imperfection in others. And even if we don't get very far into looking at the alternative, we'll at least be able to recognize lots of cases of responding to that by casting oneself as perfect and the others as bad doesn't really solve a problem.
I would say not.
Hypothetically, if we do find ourselves in a situation where we're just becoming more and more alienated and more fearful and more scared of one another, then that doesn't seem good. You know, if we're going to say anything is good and bad, then that seems bad. Now, you know, someone could come along and say, well, Simon, good and bad are just constructs, but I would still want to stick to my intuition that surely we could do better than this, and I would want to own the better. And yes, this is an idea about what's good and bad. Philosophically, you know, I might not be immediately ready with a defense of it, but I'm going to own that I do have some ideas about what's good and bad. I would prefer a reality where it's not as simplistic and disheartening as the one that I see us trapped in at the moment, where there is so much suspicion of each other and so much hatred and so much projection of badness on others. So holding up hope that we can cling on to good and bad enough to discover something that's better than that.